I hadn't traveled in the Baltic till the summer before last, and it was rather dizzying. We started in Sweden, and if you're in Sweden, the Russian, Russia is the enemy, right?
Yes.
And then we went across the water to Estonia, to Tallinn,
Yes.
which is kind of a medieval museum, and they're not pro-Russian.
No.
That's very difficult. Then we went to St. Petersburg, and if you're in St. Petersburg, the two things that they talk to you about as a tourist the most are, one, Peter the Great and building St. Petersburg, all fine, and Catherine and, Hermitage and all the rest of it. And the other is the siege. And they take you out to show you, and I mean it's terrifyingly close to the actual. It's like 5 miles or something out, and they talk about the siege and the Nazis as though it were yesterday. And then we went to Finland, where they hate the Swedes and the Russians, and then we went to Poland, where the Germans and the Russians are both the enemies, and then we went to Denmark, which tried to stay neutral, but had its trouble with Germany, and then, I went to Berlin for a day, and I had a guide in Berlin, age 41, because I asked him finally, I couldn't stand it, who took us to see Checkpoint Charlie and the Wall, and truly could not understand why Russia had been allowed to have part of his city. He had absolutely no clue why there was a wall, or had been rather, a wall.
Yes, or a carving up of the city.
Zero, whatever. And then we ended up in Amsterdam, which of course was just totally,
anti-German.
And I said to Rob afterward, and the geography was really not that great. It's not that big an area.
Yeah.
And I said, I feel like I've been through some kind of, amusement park spinner or something where you keep revolving around and the enemies all keep changing.
Well, I think what we learned from that is that history is always with us.
Absolutely.
And everything that we do, everything we're doing, we think we're making it up in the present. And we don't see this massive hand which just pushes us further. And in terms of Russia, Russia will be what it is. They won't be American. They won't be Jeffersonian Democrats. They'll be Russian, and that is it's useless for us to try to change them. At the same time, appreciate them for what they are. They're these wonderful, passionate people.
But I think that whole absolutist thing is just. I don't think it's possible to restructure them.
Well, they'll always be authoritarian. But there are. I was talking about Pushkin to somebody today, and in terms of, we're talking about censorship and Pushkin of course was the greatest poet of his time in Russia, and one sign of the Tsar's favor, Tsar Alexander II, I believe, was that Pushkin no longer had to send his poetry or his essays to the censor. From then on, the Tsar would be his censor. And so this, this was meant to be a great honor to Pushkin. Pushkin said, "Yeah, it's kind of great, but it's still a censor."
just transferring it in a way.
But the idea, that there was that authoritarian director. And of course, we could think immediately of the calls, of those rare phone calls that Stalin made to Pasternak.
Right.
In which Pasternak just froze in disbelief and in awe. We have to remember that the Russians were in awe of Stalin. He was a demigod, and when he died, people throughout the Soviet Union, including the prisons in Siberia, all cried. 3 million people attended his ceremony in Red Square.
But he had also been in charge for an awfully long time. There were people who'd grown up and never known anyone else, right?
That's right.
So
for them, it was really as if God had died. Of course, if he'd lived longer, they would have gotten to see another purge. First of the Jews and the doctors,
right? And
then he sort of regularly culled the next generation of political cadres.
So even though Russia had its revolution and the Tsar went down, and partly that was because he really wasn't so much a ruler as a family man thrust. as a czar, he was very ill-suited to the job and the time.
He was,
And he had the wrong wife.
Yes.
So it was more of a domestic, in many ways, I've always thought it was more of a domestic disaster than it was a political disaster.
Also, there's a certain tipping point at which the ones on top. Well, this is an interesting point that you're leading me to, which is that one of the questions I ask my Russian friends is, why this nostalgia for Joseph Stalin? And they say, well, back in Stalin's time, in the Soviet times, nobody had much money. It was people had perks. They might get a bit of ration. They might get an extra bottle of brandy. They might get an extra shirt or a vacation. But nobody was amassing money. And now, and it was a classless society in their mind. And now, it is a class society. And the upper class, are all thieves.
They are.
So they regard, and so everyone is quite happy at a firm authoritarian Putin bringing his heel down on the oligarchs, on the billionaires and millionaires, which is why someone like Khodorkovsky, a Russian tycoon, is now in a pen in Siberia, being beaten up by other inmates.
And that was part of your story, of course, in Wolves Eat Dogs, was
Yes.
the death of one of these guys.
Well, he's been granted a lot of Putin's been granted a lot of power because he stopped with this sort of wild capitalist swing in which nobody knew the rules. Part of the problem is that a lot of the rules aren't written.
True.
Another part of the problem is that they have an interesting attitude towards responsibility, in that if you're a deputy minister, you are, and you may also be a member of the board or an officer in a company that you are regulating. You don't have to give up one for the other. You can set the rules for the industry that your company is competing in. And you have, let's say, a substantial edge.
Okay.
It's not legal here. It's done, but it's not legal, but it's legal there.
Well, there are a lot of them who have been, exported or living in Brighton Beach or wandering around the world taking this kind of mafioso thing with them.
Well, it was interesting. I was interesting. A couple of years ago, it was late at night. It was after midnight, and I was out on a roadside diner with a couple of police and a mafia, and the police left me with my interpreter and this mafia. He was a killer. He was a contract killer, and a huge guy. Guy who spent much of his day working out. Short, bleach blonde hair, eyes were slits, and really a beefy, dangerous individual. And as we talked, he started changing into a human. I asked him, well, first I began asking about, what his scams were, how he made his money, what his day was like, what his friends were like, and he became sort of, he let loose, he relaxed, and he began telling me about his secret family that he didn't even, his colleagues didn't know about. And he couldn't tell anybody because then they would be in danger. And how his wife was a doctor, a dentist actually. And all he wanted to do was get away from Russia and with his family and go live in some place with laws.
Wow.
It was
not expected.
It was this transformation of the monster to the man was pretty fascinating.
I'm sure it was. Well, I made my little speech about the Baltic to emphasize the fact that I can understand why, if the memory of the Nazi siege in St. Petersburg is that strong today, why Stalin would, have a status as one of the, people that held them off in a way that those of us who've moved on, more from World War II might have a little trouble with.
In Stalin's Ghost, not only is Stalin's ghost seen on the platform of the metro
right,
waving benignly to the passengers as they go by, but it leads, of course, the story leads us to this town called Tver, which is a very patriotic town, a very poor town, up the Volga, about 2 or 3 hours drive from Moscow.